The governor of Oklahoma fires several members of the State Board of Education because, as he says, it's become too political. What laws are now being looked at not only in Texas, but also in other states nowhere near the border. And we're at the international bridge as migrants who crossed illegally are handed over to Mexican immigration. I am Yami Virgin with Sinclair Broadcasting in San Antonio, Texas, for a new edition of Immigration Crisis, the Fight for the Southern Border. And now we're joined by my colleague, Jordan Elder, who has also been covering the border extensively for the last couple of years. And Jordan, there's a lot of legislative changes that are coming up in Texas, and we only meet every other year. So when we do something, it just comes like a wave. So what new laws are being proposed right now in Austin?
So not only are we seeing new border bills proposed in Austin, we're seeing them across the country as well. There are a lot of new ideas being proposed here in Texas related to border funding and the wall and different task forces that could eventually be at the border. But some of the bigger headlines right now are bills that are coming about in legislatures that are nowhere near the border, like Missouri and Iowa and Kentucky, for example, but they're taking cues from Texas. So if you'll remember in 2023, Texas passed Senate Bill 4. It was a very controversial bill. It would allow law enforcement to arrest people who were in the country illegally and return them to the border. It's been held up in court pretty much since it went into effect. But a big trend that we're seeing around the country now is other states introducing something similar and wanting to authorize their law enforcement to do the same thing. So that's one of the big trends that we're seeing across the nation.
What's the sentiment here in Austin with some of the new bills? And I mean, we're seeing the budget. You had a breakdown, I want to say a couple of days ago. I saw an email you sent out with a breakdown of how much money we're spending when we're talking about border security.
Well, one of the things when President Trump was elected is there were Texas leaders that said, okay, maybe we can scale back how much money we're spending on the border because the federal government is going to be there now and they're going to put more resources toward it. But we haven't seen that scale back quite yet. I believe there's another pretty big proposal for this biennium, the next 2 years, that's in the billions, but experts that I spoke to, the way that they're seeing it is we can't stop our work on the border. We might be able to reallocate some of those resources, but they are of the mentality that we are only going to have Trump in office for 4 years and nobody knows what's next. So the mentality of Texas continuing to do this is we need to solidify what we expect of the border for whoever is president. And that's why the state needs to take these actions. And this gets caught up in controversy a lot because immigration is technically supposed to be a federal issue. The federal government is supposed to handle it. So having Texas go to these measures to pass border bills and regulate the border is something that kind of toes the line. And we've seen a lot of back and forth about some of the things Texas has done because of that.
I saw one of the items, I think it was $39 billion. And in some places, it makes sense. When you go to Del Rio and you speak to a Sheriff Joe Frank, who says all he wants them to do is to finish the border wall in the area where you just walk and you can just walk in and out, because it diverts any huge groups that come in from Del Rio proper, from the city to areas on the outside where Border Patrol can get people. So for someone that's a Democrat, a sheriff on the border to say, this is all I want done, I mean, do you think it's going to gain any momentum from the people you've spoken to? Do you think there's going to be enough momentum for them to be able to finish that work? Because in reality, yeah, Trump has 4 years, but we have, House elections coming up in 2 years. So do you think they'll be able to get done what they want to do?
I think the border is a big enough issue right now nationwide that they might. I don't know if all of these different measures that they're proposing will pass, but I think a good number of them will just because the election showed that's what people want to see and that it's a concern. And what we're seeing not only in Texas is states that are nowhere near the border at all are introducing these measures that are aimed at illegal immigration and migrants. One that stood out to me because I grew up in Missouri, there is a bill in Missouri that would create the Missouri Illegal Alien Certified Bounty Hunter Program, which would certify people to be bounty hunters, and you would get a $1,000 payout for reporting someone who was in the country illegally. That's a real bill that was proposed in Missouri. It was also proposed in Mississippi, but it's already been shot down there. Tennessee, they have a bill that's moving through right now where the state would send a bill to parents who enroll an undocumented child in a public school. And the acronym for that bill is the Trump Act, the Tennessee Reduction of Unlawful Migrant Placement. So a lot of those bills, for example, are more about the headlines. They're not necessarily going to pass. It's going to take a lot to get both houses on board with that, but it's about the statement that it's sending that immigration matters to people. And even in states that aren't border states, it's something that their residents want to see. So there's still a lot of question about like, is this a statement or is this a solution? But we're seeing a lot more of this.
Yeah, I know Oklahoma, the governor just fired the head of the education department. I forget what the exact title is, but he just got fired because he had similar bills. And the question is, and I've traveled with this following immigration. When you go to Europe and you look at some of the cases, like in Germany, where they had all the Syrians that came in and they accepted them, they stopped the flow, but they understood that the people that were there had to be treated in a humane way. And when you're talking about children, what are they going to do if they are not at school? They're going to be kept in a house because everybody's scared. And I think that's the question that people have to ask themselves in all reality. Do we really expect that we are going to get every single person out of this country? It just doesn't seem realistic.
And
I
states are asking themselves that too. The headline bills probably aren't going to pass, but we're seeing a lot of states take ICE into their own hands as well and say, okay, we are either going to require our law enforcement agencies to cooperate with ICE and assist them, or the other end of the spectrum, you have states like I believe Oregon, potentially California, saying we are going to specifically not require our law enforcement to work with ICE, and they're doing more legislation to solidify sanctuary cities. So we're seeing it on both ends of the spectrum here, but something that typically would be a federal level thing, states are looking at it and saying, okay, what can we do to further what we want to see with this?
When you spoke to State Representative Lujan, who represents the southern part of San Antonio, it is predominantly Hispanic. He's a Republican. What did he tell you about the sentiment in Austin right now for this legislative session?
We didn't talk specifically about the border legislation. We talked a lot about bail reform, and specifically how that relates to human smuggling. But you can tell that it's something that's top of mind for a lot of the lawmakers in Austin. This is something that's been a big deal to Texas for several years. And even now, with a new federal administration, it's clear that this is still something that's going to be a priority.
With the bail reform and human smuggling, talk to us a little bit more about that. What are they trying to pass right now in Austin? It's a huge problem. The majority of the people that we were seeing in those counties that are closer to the border, the majority of the people were under 18 and usually would come from different areas of the state of Texas, not even from border towns.
Right. And the state in the last session passed a mandatory minimum. So if you are convicted of human smuggling under this statute, it's a minimum of 10 years in prison, no matter who you are, no matter how old you are. That's the statute. But there aren't any limits on bond and on bail. So one of the governor's emergency items for this session is bail reform. So if you are accused of murder or you have been convicted of murder and you're committing crimes, his intention is you would not be released on bond. You would not get a bond amount. You would not get a bond hearing. His idea is you have shown that you are a danger, and that's not something that you should be afforded. When I was talking to Representative Lujan, though, we have seen a case here in Bexar County where there was a person who was accused of smuggling 26 people who was arrested for it. His bond was reduced, he got out, and he continued smuggling. So, in speaking with Representative Lujan, he was saying we need to look at that too. Human smuggling obviously is not murder, but are there other crimes where we should consider this because the risk is high of people continuing?
Okay, let me ask you, and we'll close up with this. So, when you moved down here, you're originally from Kansas City. And
Yes.
I remember when you first moved down here and you went to the border for the first time. Talk to people about going there and hearing so much about the border and actually getting to the border, like what things were real and what things weren't when you got there.
So when I first went to the border, it was probably 2022, and things looked very different, especially in Eagle Pass, which is where I would say I go the most often. It's much more locked down now than it was when I first got there. I remember my photographer and I pulled up the very first time we were under one of the international bridges looking at the Rio Grande, and we watched three people hop in the water and just start swimming across. And he was getting video of it, and I was like, "Am I watching this happen right now? Is this really happening?" And he was like, "Yeah, this is kind of how it is." And I was like, "Do what happens now?" And he was like, "Border Patrol or DPS will either come by or they won't, and they'll just kind of keep moving." And I was like, "This is." I just had never seen anything like it because I feel like if you live somewhere else, all you really see is the clips that are on the news. And then now it looks completely different. Like that spot where we were standing, we can't get anywhere close to it now because there's concertina wire and there are shipping containers and there's wall in some places over there. There's a bunch of physical barriers, and that part of Shelby Park is closed down. But you're also hard pressed to see any crossings right now. We are seeing very, very low numbers. So the odds of going to that exact same spot and seeing that exact same thing are very low right now, about 3 years later.
Yeah, and what I find amazing is that even though people want to give credit to the US, to Biden for signing that executive order last year, and to President Trump, in all reality, it's what Mexico's doing. They're not going to get to the border if they're stopping them before the border. And with 15,000 extra soldiers, that would appear to be what truly is going on. So when we talk about things that you have followed, like the buoys, do they really seem like they're necessary and doing their job at the cost of more than $1 million? What do you think's going to happen to them?
I think, well, every problem kind of requires a multi-layer approach. And I think the idea with the buoys in particular is that it would be part of that layered approach. But the 1,000 feet that we saw out there, the governor has always said that that was the trial run. That was the test run. They were wanting to see how it would go. Um, when we have been out there, because it's only 1,000 feet, you can get around them. And because they've kind of built up sediment, the river is super shallow. So it's not difficult to walk around them or keep going. They're double now, so there's about 2,000 feet as of last month. So I haven't gotten to see them in person since they installed the new set down by the river. But in my mind, that's something that we know Border Patrol was considering as um, a solution in Trump's first presidency. So could it be something this time around that we see expanded? And it's not just 2,000 feet of buoys in Eagle Pass, Texas, but is that something that they use near San Diego and in other places? And we don't know the answer to that yet, but it's one of the solutions that they've been looking at in the several that they're considering.
Yeah, it's interesting. Every time we go down, there's something new. Well, thank you so much, Jordan, for joining us on the podcast. And you can watch, you also have a border watch, right? You want to tell them when it comes on and where?
Yes, every week we do a Texas Border Watch episode, which is just a quick rundown of everything new that's happened at the border that week. We'll look at some of the new topics and keep you updated on what's happening and how it relates to Texas.
All right. Thank you so much, Jordan Elder. And now we go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, with our colleague and friend Brenna Rose, who broke the story of the firing of the majority of the members of the Oklahoma State Board of Education over immigration. And now we're joined by Brenna Rose. She is an anchor reporter with our sister station up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, KTUL. Brenna, thanks for joining us. And, you know, a lot of people wonder, the immigration debate and talk does go beyond the southern border and the northern border. What has been going on in your neck of the woods this week? A lot of news coming out of your state.
Yeah, over the past few weeks here in Oklahoma, I would say that we have made national headlines related to immigration policies in Oklahoma schools. But this issue, it dates back to August, well before the election, well before President Trump took office rather. So back in August, State Superintendent Ryan Walters, so he is the person who is in charge of education here in the state of Oklahoma. So he brought up this idea that he wanted to start tracking the immigration status of students in Oklahoma schools. And he was approaching it from a cost standpoint. He said that he wanted to find the so-called burden to the school system and as well to Oklahoma taxpayers when it comes to having undocumented immigrants, particularly in Oklahoma schools. At that point, right from the get-go, there was a lot of pushback from school districts, more than a dozen school districts saying, we're not going to follow this rule. He said, I'm going to give some guidance in the coming weeks. Fast forward to October, and that's when he filed a lawsuit against the federal government saying that Oklahoma is owed $474 million because of the so-called failures in the Biden-Harris administration to secure the border. I've got a quote from him here. He says, so what we're seeing is the perfect storm of Kamala Harris as the border czar not doing her job. Illegal immigrants have poured into our state. We are then required to educate those children with Oklahoma taxpayer dollars.
All right. So that happens. And then all of a sudden, you know, President Trump takes office, the raids begin. What has that looked like in Oklahoma? Because a lot of the people that do work the farms, the chicken farms, the this, the that, the actual workers, a huge amount of them are migrants, aren't they?
To my understanding, I also feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect when it comes to understanding for most folks how many immigrants, and we're not talking about undocumented, documented, just immigrants as a whole here in Oklahoma. So State Superintendent Ryan Walters, I was doing an interview with him 3 weeks ago. The interview was set up in regards to changing the curriculum to reflect the Gulf of America instead of the Gulf of Mexico. So I did the interview with him. I was talking about that. And then he brought up immigration in schools. And obviously I go back to August and I said, okay, where are we at with that? What's going on with that? And he said that, the effort was to push that forward. He'd had conversations with the Trump administration. And basically the main thing is that he was going to collect that information about students and then give that to the Trump administration and see what they want to do with it. At that point, I asked, okay, are you ruling out raids on Oklahoma schools? And the response that he gave me, I'm just going to play it so you can hear it completely.
Look, we will not allow schools to be sanctuary schools anymore. We will turn over information to the Trump administration so that they can make decisions on where illegal immigrants are, how big the problem is. So we have already announced that we're going to do those things. President Trump is doing that nationwide, so we're happy to work with him on that. And look, we're going to make sure that his policies are enforced.
You also wouldn't rule out raids in schools. So which is it? Educational resources or enforcement of immigration policies?
Oh, it's absolutely both. I've been crystal clear on that.
So that was kind of the clip that went viral it ended up, some of my friends are journalists in Canada, and they messaged me 2 days later and said, whoa, 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 what is going on in Oklahoma schools? That exact soundbite as well, too, was played on CNN. The New York Times ended up quoting that. I had a follow-up interview with him afterwards because we just received so many phone calls. So my social media was going crazy. I had a woman stop me in the grocery store and say she voted for President Trump, but she did not think that there would be ICE raids in her daughter's school and that they would be checking the immigration status of her classmates. So I feel like we suddenly had two different issues going on here. One was the immigration status, checking that of students and what they were going to use that information for. And then the other was this ICE raid situation, which I asked Ryan Walters in that follow-up interview if he actually had conversations with the Trump administration about that. And he said he had, but would not provide any details.
I know you told me last week that you're not against the potential for ICE raids in Oklahoma schools. And I just want to clarify, have you had any conversations with the Trump administration about either checking immigration status of Oklahoma students and the potential for raids?
We've had private conversations with the Trump administration on how they're going to carry out some of their policies, and I'm going to keep that between us till they want to make any announcements. But what we've clearly indicated to them is we're going to get you the information you need, and we're going to work with any kind of law enforcement that you see necessary. And I want to remind your audience, ICE officials are professionals. They take their job very seriously. They carry it out in a very professional manner. And so I've seen a lot of scare tactics from the left on this, of worst case scenario, of just acting like the sky is falling. But here's the reality. They are professionals there to carry out a job. They are in law enforcement. We will work with them. As a matter of fact, it's a felony not to work with them. So, of course, I will work with them. Our schools will work with them. We will continue to make sure that President Trump has the support he needs.
Can you give any more insight into how that would work? Would these be plainclothes officers?
No, I can't. That's going to be up to President Trump and his administration.
So we're still trying to figure out who said what this information is being used for. And then fast forward 2 weeks, and obviously the governor made a huge announcement.
That's what we're focused on. I think that's what President Trump's focused on. And unfortunately, we've got people that are really trying to attack 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old kids. And I'm not going to let that happen. You know, no, I haven't made anything off limits. The first step is to make sure that we have a fresh set of eyes. And again, having these folks, having really good Oklahomans on these different boards and commissions is really the first step that the governor can do. We've got a weird system in Oklahoma that you look to your governor and say, hey, governor, go fix education. But then there's a separately elected superintendent of education. And so, you know, but the bottom line is when you think about the outcomes and you think about where our kids are compared to other states, we're not doing as well as we should. And so we have to get that fixed. And we've got to make sure that kids are learning in the classrooms. And that's the big overall picture here that I'm trying to make sure that we get fresh set of eyes on that school board.
And that was the news that was heard all over the place, that the governor was going to end up firing half of the state board. So why did he end up firing half of them? And also the original person who started this whole thing about the raids.
Yeah, so a lot of people were waiting for someone to take action. Mothers were coming up to me in my Pilates class saying someone needs to do something. So this was obviously a long time coming that some sort of action was being taken. The Oklahoma Board of Education voted to approve this rule regarding immigration status of students. So they voted to approve it. It still had to go to the legislature and then to the governor in order for it to become law. We saw the governor take unprecedented action and basically call the board out and say that they're being too political and that they need to focus on educating children, which at the end of the day, Oklahoma is very low in when you look at all the other states and the education system and the test scores. Oklahoma ranks really near the bottom. He also called out Ryan Walters for treating children essentially as political pawns. Now, Governor Kevin Stitt, he's hardline. He's got very strong feelings when it comes to immigration. He does not support illegal immigration. He wants to get illegal immigrants, his words, out of the state. He says going and targeting children is not the right way to do that.
Amazing. So we're not talking about someone that would be a raging liberal, as some people would call this. You're talking about someone that has run for office, is the governor of the state of Oklahoma, who has said he is not in support of any sort of illegal immigration, but he said stop, and he pumped the brakes and he stopped it. What has been the reaction of the people of Oklahoma?
I think people are incredibly happy that he feels that way. There was a lot of fear from parents of migrant children and regular American Oklahoman parents. Like this is an issue that really impacted and enraged a lot of folks. And we're still trying to figure out the impact on how many students have potentially unenrolled from schools. One of my colleagues, Tanya Motorzitsky, she did an interview with a member of the Tulsa Public School Board. And he said, she did the interview in January. And since the winter break, they had roughly 100 Hispanic students unenroll. The officials with the school district won't confirm that on the record, but
that's
he's a member
open
of the
records.
board.
Why wouldn't they confirm it? That's part of open records.
And a lot of literally no in Oklahoma will go on the record and say how many students have unenrolled because of what's going on.
Is the feeling in Oklahoma, I mean, that the laws need to be carried out, we're all clear, that there's some people that have gotten into the country illegally that we need to worry about. We're clear on that. But I think even for parents, everyday parents that are U.S. citizens, having to send your child to school, 5-year-old Johnny or 10-year-old Susan, watching a raid as they're dragging out their friend Maria from class, screaming and yelling, that's going to be a little traumatic for parents to think that it's okay to do this inside a school.
Yeah, I think the general consensus here amongst folks is that it's not okay. This obviously, in order for that rule that was passed by the board to become law, it has to go through the legislature. And I have numerous sources who are members of the state house of representatives, the Senate, have told me that, they don't agree with this. They're not okay with this. And it's somewhat shocking that this even elevated to the point that it did. And going back to your other question about Governor Kevin Stitt, he has been very clear that he does not support illegal immigration. And for him, the focus right now is predominantly on prisons. So there's roughly 500 people in prison who could potentially be deported. And so he's kind of said, he wants to go after the criminals, the people that are not doing good, causing harm. And that's his focus. Definitely not children.
All right. Well, Brenna, I really appreciate you joining us, and we want to check back in and see how things are going in Oklahoma. I think people sometimes don't have the image that there's a lot of immigrants in rural America, but I remember when I was a reporter up in Wisconsin having to cover a fire at a chicken farm that was between Milwaukee and Madison, and I headed back to the station, and my boss goes, "Great, you got a lot of interviews." And I go, "Well, I have a lot of interviews in Spanish." And he looked at me like I had 3 heads. He goes, "What do you mean?" And I go, "Well, who do you think is working?" Everybody that was working, there was over 50 employees. All of them only spoke Spanish. And Oklahoma being rural and having farms and everything else, you got to figure you guys have a huge number of undocumented migrants that are working the fields in Oklahoma or with animals and helping our food chain in some way, shape, or form. So I know that we're going to be checking more with you guys about this, but is this something that you see that could possibly turn to be a problem if people decide to go back because they're in fear?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A lot of the talk regarding our nation's food supply is centered around California and workers in the fields there. But we have that here. And I feel like there have not been enough conversations surrounding that. Even when you think about the proximity, I-35 goes straight through Oklahoma. We do have a large Hispanic population, but I also want to note, we also have a very large immigrant population. I was at a clinic over the weekend that does these immigration medical exams. And there's only one in Tulsa. And the doctor told me that she's like, we're drowning. There's just so many people. And she said, there's a fear amongst everyone. And then when you think about it, if you need to pass a physical, and you're scared, your blood pressure, is probably through the roof at that point.
So everybody's freaking out. And we're talking about the legal, pathway to immigration. When you get to a certain point, you have to do the blood test, you have to do the vaccines, you have to do everything because you're at the point already. You have a green card. You're going to become a resident of the U.S. So that's another story that we have not looked into. But yeah, let us know if you decide to investigate a little bit more on that angle. Anything else that you wanted to add before we leave you?
I just think it's really interesting that Oklahoma, every single county here voted for Trump. There's a lot of people who I've spoken with who voted for him specifically because of his immigration policies. I just feel like there's a large misconception here. And what we have been, making headlines for here in Oklahoma related to kids. I just, I hope at the end of the day that we can put the politics aside and focus in this particular issue on what really matters,
Well, we really thank you. It's always good to get another look. We're always at the border here and we're following what's happening. This was ground zero, but things are changing. And of course, with that, especially the things that President Trump ran his campaign on. And a lot of people, I think there is a disconnect and a disbelief at some of the things that he's doing, but he was very straightforward about what he was going to do. And I think there's going to be a lot more coming. The things that keep me up at night are mostly the number of people that are not caught. In Panama last month, 36 Iranians were caught coming in illegally through Panama, and they were stopped there. You have to wonder how many other people that may not have good intentions, may not want to work in the United States have gotten already through. And those are the people that I think we really need to worry about.
Yeah, and to your point there too, you mentioned people from other countries. I feel like there is this misconception that everyone that's here illegally is from a certain country or maybe three countries. And here in Oklahoma, our Attorney General has been very outspoken, and our governor, about the fact that there's people from China who are here working illegally on these marijuana grow-ups. So that's another angle to the story and how the state has been impacted by illegal immigration.
Wow. Well, we will check back in with you guys. And thank you so much. We know you're getting ready for a big storm that's going to hit you there. The cold's coming down south. We're expecting it to be down in the 20s in Texas. And we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Brenna, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
At the border, the number of migrants being deported has gone down. We accepted the invitation to see the repatriation firsthand. at the International Bridge in Eagle Pass, Texas. We have seen how migrants cross into the U.S. illegally through the Rio Grande. But this is the first time we're allowed to record the process of how they're deported or expelled at the U.S.-Mexico border. Photojournalist Paul Sanchez and I arrived at the Firefly Processing Center around 7 a.m. to follow the first group of the day being sent back to Mexico. Acting Chief of Border Patrol Del Rio Sector, Milton Moreno, met us at the area where migrants are brought out and board buses under the watchful eye of agents.
We transfer them over to our processing facility. There we vet their records. We ensure that they are, who they claim to be. And if they don't have any criminal charges pending here in the U.S.
If they do have charges, they will not be released to Mexico so easily.
Those that do have a criminal history are processed accordingly and turned over to ICRO for further detention and processing.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, can hold them longer while they investigate their records and determine if they can repatriate them to their country of origin. This morning, those without a criminal record are being placed on buses and sent to one of the bridges in Eagle Pass, Texas. This process happens daily in coordination with Mexico's immigration authorities.
We are able to quickly return these illegal aliens back into Mexico, and the government of Mexico has been a great partner in accepting the CVNHs as we talked about, so Cuban, Venezuelans, Haitians, Nicaraguas, and here recently they added Central Americans, Guatemalans, Salvador, and Honduras, and obviously the Mexican nationals.
Executive order signed by President Donald Trump now allows this group, which previously had temporary protected status or TPS, to be deported.
Every day we coordinate with government of Mexico, our counterparts in Mexican immigration. We turn over the illegal aliens over to them, and we tend to do them during daylight hours between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m.
Where do they go from there?
From there, Mexico either takes them into the interior of Mexico, Mexico City, by bus or by plane, and some into their native country.
Acting Chief Moreno says this system seems to be helping reduce the number of migrants who attempt to return illegally to the U.S. Are you seeing people come back?
We have not. In years past, we used to see that recidivism where you apprehend the same person on 3 consecutive days. We have not seen that now because you return them back into the interior of Mexico or to their native country, and it makes it more difficult for them to start that journey again.
One by one, 4 buses filled with migrants arrive and passengers are unloaded. As you can see, all traffic stopped at the bridge. They are then transferred to Mexican immigration buses under the supervision of Mexican immigration officers. What are you guys doing right now that you have that breathing time?
Well, right now we continue to enforce our laws, and our agents are back out in the field and focusing more on targeting and intelligence and going after the criminal aliens. We continue to work with our partners day to day, whether it be Texas DPS, Texas National Guard, Texas Military Department, local police department here in Eagle Pass and Del Rio, and local sheriffs. So together we continue to enhance border security.
Moreno emphasizes that this is key to keeping the border secure from those who might enter undetected. He also says that the new administration is allowing them to do their job effectively.
Just let us do our job, and we'll enhance not just border security like I mentioned, but security in the entire country.
That is all for this week for another edition of Immigration Crisis, the Fight for the Southern Border. In San Antonio, Texas, for Sinclair Broadcasting, I'm Yami Virgin, where we continue to be the eyes and the ears of what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border.